No, I mean, if you need to give us directions, just speak up so I can. One of the great things about watching bear cam is that you get to see a wide diversity of behaviors, especially regarding their fishing styles. And bear fishing styles really do help to demonstrate a bear's adaptability, individuality, and their ability to learn. My name is Mike Fitz, your resident naturalist with Explore.org, the world's largest live nature cam network.
And I'm John, Ranger John from Katmai Conservancy.
And today we're talking about bear fishing styles. So this is prime time for watching bears at Brooks Falls. We're approaching peak bear numbers at Brooks River. And so we want to explain over the next half hour just a little bit about the variety of fishing styles and techniques that you might be seeing on the bear cams. And we'll also try to answer your questions about that as well. So if you do have questions for us about bear fishing styles, drop them in the chat, on the live chat comment section on Explore.org, and we'll be happy to try to answer those for you. So the moderators will be sending questions my way, and I'll look for those throughout the chat, and also afterwards we'll try to get to those questions. So yeah, a lot of great stuff we've been seeing recently, John. It seems kind of obvious, right, why the bears are here, but I think that actually deserves a little bit of explanation. Mm-hmm. You know, why are we seeing brown bears, kind of gathering at Brooks Falls?
Right. Well, the obvious reason is that there are so many salmon here, but what's less obvious is that because there are a lot of salmon in different parts of Alaska, but we're here on the Brooks River in the Bristol Bay watershed, which actually gets the biggest salmon run of anywhere in the world. And so last year there was over 60 million salmon in the Bristol Bay watershed, and about 20% of those end up coming up the Brooks River. Is that correct?
20% of the Naknek escape.
Of the Naknek escape, sorry. So up the Naknek River, and then some percentage of those end up in the Brooks River. So 20% come up the Naknek River, of which we're a part of that same watershed. And what happens here is that we have this waterfall here, which actually creates a natural barrier, which makes it a lot easier for the bears to catch so many salmon. And so this is a place where early on in the season, the bears are able to catch a very large amount of salmon. Later on, there will be a lot of salmon in other places, but right now, this is really where the salmon are and where they're easiest to catch. And why is it important that they be so easy to catch? Well, the bears are trying to expend the least amount of energy in order to catch the most amount of salmon. If you spend too much energy, well, then you've got to catch even more salmon. And so if you can catch salmon efficiently, then that's the way you're going to want to do it. And so for those people who have been watching the bear cams, one thing that you might see a lot on the falls is that the larger male adult bears will seem to prefer, they try different fishing styles, but as far as positioning goes, those bears seem to prefer those pools that are right at the bottom of the falls. And those are places where they can just sort of sit and don't have to expend a lot of energy. And so the bigger dominant bears seem to prefer those pools where they can sit. Am I seeing this correctly, Mike, in terms of energy expenditure and positioning around the falls?
I think so. I think it's when you're watching bear fishing styles and their fishing techniques, a lot of their behavior really boils down to as you were getting to, the economics of energy. They want to not expend any energy, really. They want to just sit in the water and wait for their meals to come to them. Not all bears are able to secure fishing spots that allow them to do that, and the salmon aren't always abundant enough for that to happen either. But yeah, when you're watching bear and you're watching their behavior, think about it from their mindset, trying to eat a year's worth of food in 6 months or less, and how that can impact your strategies for acquiring food. So doing that most efficiently is quite important. And we see that, I think, most prominently with those big adult males that dominate most often the preferred fishing spots at Brooks Falls. So sitting below in that plunge pool that we nicknamed the jacuzzi, that's a spot where we see consistently large adult males fishing, kind of like on the far side of Brooks Falls too, from where the camera is located, that far pool. They'll stand and wait in there. Sometimes we'll see adult males go to the lip of the falls, but a lot of times that space is left available for younger bears or females, and even females with cubs to exploit. So that energy economics sort of idea, that was an idea that I first was sort of introduced to by reading a book by Bernd Heinrich called Bumblebee Economics. And basically he was just talking about how bumblebees, live their lives and do a lot of different things in these amazing ways. But it often has to do with efficiency and expenditure. So when an animal is living in a world where food resources are scarce, or maybe you can't necessarily you can't necessarily expect that you're going to know where your next meal comes from. It really does pay to be most efficient with your fishing strategies.
So, Mike, does we know that the different bears have different styles, and resulting from that, does that help us actually identify bears sometimes when we're watching bears out here? I mean, a lot of people say, well, how do you know? And they'll talk about the physical characteristics of the bears, but do these different behaviors also help us figure out, oh, this is this bear and not that bear?
It really helps me. Because bears are creatures of habit. They will change their habits. They'll try new fishing styles if something doesn't work. But especially the mature bears that are more easy to identify at the waterfall, they have their preferred fishing spots, preferred fishing techniques, for instance. So, for example, I've never seen number 747, who's a giant adult male, go to the lip of the falls and fish there. He's almost always in the jacuzzi or near those rocks on the far side. Some bears will exploit other fishing techniques. We'll talk about number 128 on the lip of the falls a little bit later on, but that's one of her preferred fishing spots. So you can kind of, if you're wondering about which bears you're looking at, you're trying to learn about their individual lives, those fishing styles or those behaviors that can help you to identify them a bit more easily. It's one of the things that I look for fairly consistently when I'm trying to recognize individual bears on the river. And I think maybe that's a good segue into talking about different fishing styles itself. One of the ones that we were discussing yesterday that's fairly universal among all bears is just like a broad searching technique. I don't know if you can see any bears behind us right now. There's a bunch that are sitting and standing, but they're also moving through this area looking for anything that really can't swim away. So you'll see them searching. That's a common behavior throughout Brooks River. Especially later in the season as more bears try to scavenge for dead and dying salmon. At this time of the year, they'll still do that, but not to the same extent they will later on. And they'll also do a technique, John, called snorkeling. Okay. And that's a kind of a famous technique for a lot of brown bears where they will stick their faces in the water and they'll look for, again, anything that really can't swim away. So dead and dying salmon, primarily, that's what they're searching for using that snorkeling technique. But it may help them to spot salmon in the water so they can lunge and try to grab them, charge through the water and grab them. Bears can't smell fish under the water. Again, they need air passing across their nasal cavity to pick up scents. So they're not sticking their faces under the water to smell fish, but they're just kind of doing that to get a better look, to see what might be available. Of course, that's not the only fishing technique. We've been seeing other ones as well, like standing at the waterfall. You've been enjoying that, I think, quite a bit when we've been watching bears at the falls.
Yeah, so, I mentioned the first time I was on bear cam that one bear, 128, also called Grazer, is a prolific lip fisher, as we call it, and she has been keeping that up, really, from the first day I came out to the falls up until now. She has been fishing the lip very successfully, and just really putting on a lot of weight. Her belly is sagging ponderously already. And as Mike already mentioned, we also see some of the mother bears, even with yearling cubs, will fish on the lip with 3 cubs, just kind of at her heels, basically. And when she is able to catch a fish right out of the air, or with a paw, then she will try to rip as much off as she can before one of her cubs steals it from her, and then which is another style of fishing we'll get to, which is fish stealing. But yeah, so fishing the lip is another style often used by female bears, smaller bears, and juvenile bears as well, with a lot of success.
Yeah, that and going back to sort of like the efficiency and the energy economics of bears. So that standing on the lip or sitting and waiting below Brooks Falls is probably the most efficient, method of fishing. Because the bears, especially when it's really hot like this, they are not expending any extra energy sitting in the water. And in fact, it's probably quite comfortable for them. I mean, we've been experiencing all-time high temperatures in this area over the past week or so. And that's just not temperatures are hot, but like never before recorded hot in this area.
Right.
Temperatures approaching 90 degrees even in Katmai and in King Salmon, so really warm temperatures. So if you're a big brown bear, you've got a lot of fur on you, a lot of body mass, a digestive tract that has a lot of food in it. It's kind of like a big fermentation tank on there. Not like an ungulate, they don't have the bacteria in there like a cow will that helps them to digest greens in the same way. But they have a big stomach, a lot of food digesting in there, and when you have a big meal, you tend to produce more heat eventually just by metabolizing that energy. So sitting in the water really is an efficient fishing technique for brown bears. The jacuzzi is a great spot for bears to do that. The lip of the waterfall, as you're talking about, is great, but fish aren't always jumping.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you a question though, Mike, because we've talked so much about conserving energy, but also that these spots at the base of the falls are great places for big bears to conserve energy. But there's also the question of dominance that plays a role in all of this. And so the other night I saw something really interesting, which was so there were 4 large adult bears fishing in these relatively low energy expenditure spots, like just sitting there at the base of the falls waiting for fish to come. And I saw bear 747, who is the largest bear we have here on the river. None of the other bears he was in the jacuzzi. None of the other large bears were challenging him for his spot, but he went from spot to spot. He left his spot at the jacuzzi and went and displaced each of these other large adult bears from their positions under the falls, one at a time, and they all quickly yielded to him. So there doesn't really seem to have been his dominance doesn't seem to have been in question, but I imagine energy for him to wander and get up, move into these other spaces, displace them from their positions where he was. And meanwhile, smaller, younger bears, the fish after fish after fish. And so I wonder, when it comes to, because we talk so much about dominance, like who's really winning out there? The bear who's going and asserting his dominance, or the bear who's kind of being smart and just catching fish after fish in a different position, where the big dominant bear is not going to go and displace them from.
Yeah, I think it's quite complicated, because you see 747 is a successful bear. I mean, he is really fat for this time of the year. Again, like fat as a fall bear is fat. So he's carrying a lot of fat reserves from last year. He's gaining a lot of fat this year, but he's certainly expending energy, maintaining his rank within the hierarchy. So, when we think about brown bears here at Brooks River, what I often am toying around in my mind is that brown bears evolved across, in habitats with less food availability than what we have here at Brooks River. In Eurasia, for instance, in areas with limited food resources. So I think there's other selection pressures that are sort of ingrained within these bears, within their genes, that tell them to act in certain ways. And it may not be, acting dominant may not be the most efficient way to gain access to fishing spots. When salmon are super abundant, I mean, there's fish everywhere. You don't need to necessarily maintain one fishing spot, because there's a lot of other fishing spots that you can go to. But I think over time it pays off, especially when salmon are less abundant. Let's say if we start to see very, very few salmon running into the river, maybe the jacuzzi is the only productive fishing spot, or maybe the far pool is the only productive fishing spot. But again, when you think about bears on like the steppes of Siberia, uh, defending a caribou carcass, there's not hundreds of caribou carcasses. There aren't like a half dozen good, places to gain caribou carcasses. So what you got to do as a big dominant bear is sit on that carcass and maintain your presence there. Act dominant, chase the other bears away. So I think there's probably some other selection factors going on that get ingrained in these bears over time, over the ages, and we see that expressed in these really dominant bears. But interestingly enough, there was a study that came out of that some researchers did at McNeil River, just north of Katmai National Park, a few years ago, and they found that dominant bears didn't actually catch more fish than those subordinate bears. The subordinate bears just kind of fit in where they could, and their success rate was actually fairly high during that time. So it's an interesting question to ponder. Sitting and waiting is certainly the most efficient technique, but we see that brown bears don't always just sit and wait there.
Right.
They're behaving in a lot of different ways.
So are there any other techniques that we haven't touched on yet?
Yeah, so we talk a little bit about the bears on the lip of the waterfall. Excuse me, just checking to see if everyone can hear us, and it sounds like we're still there. One of those ones that we'll see at this time of the year, especially from very hungry bears, is the dash and grab, we like to call it. That's where a bear charges through the water and tries to basically pounce and surprise on fish. And that technique is a technique that's not as energy efficient, of course, as sitting and waiting, but not all bears have that option to sit and wait. And I think you probably can hear the audio of a couple of bears that are competing over a fishing spot right now in the riffles. So they're not chasing fish right now, but those bears are competing over fishing spots. But when you watch the dash and grab, I think that really demonstrates their athleticism more than anything else. I mean, it's kind of an animal that's quick enough and powerful enough to charge through the water and catch a fish that's trying to swim away. Their success rate really goes up when there's large schools of salmon moving through Brooks River. So if there's just 3 or 4 salmon moving through, the dash and grab is not a great technique. But it definitely does demonstrate their athleticism, and that's one that we see a lot of younger bears and hungrier bears demonstrate quite often.
Yeah. So one thing I've been thinking about is right now it's been so hot and we've had so little precipitation here that the water level is much lower than it would be on a typical year, or somewhat lower than it would be. Does that affect the success rate of, say, a dash and grab technique or any of the other techniques?
I think it does, yeah, because more water means salmon have more escape routes. So if there's less water in Brooks River, that means bears might have a better chance of catching salmon, especially if salmon are running in high numbers. So when you have a high water year, lots of places for salmon to escape to, that I think that's certainly going to lower the catch rate of bears who are trying that dash and grab technique. And maybe for people watching at home, maybe the easiest place for them to see those differences from year to year is at the mouth of Brooks River, when the water level is low and there's a lot of fish running. A lot of females with cubs that hang out in that area will charge through the water and make a living successfully catching salmon.
Yeah, I have seen a lot of bears using that technique on the lower river and at the mouth. I've also seen just the other night, Saturday night, I had the opportunity to watch bears overnight, which is a pretty rare thing to get to do. And I saw bear 813, who has a very distinctive shaped nostril, giving her the name nostril bear. And I saw her using this technique right at the falls very successfully with cubs in tow. And I'm wondering if, and I also, the first time I was on bear cam, of course, I also was elated to see 128 using this technique very successfully right at the falls, just going from pool to pool, using that athleticism and that ingenuity that we talk about with her so often. I'm wondering if now that she's put on so much weight, if she's still, I doubt she's using dash and grab so much these days. I haven't seen her use it. Have you seen 128 using the dash and grab technique?
128, not very often. I mean, She is definitely a bear that is quite pudgy for this time of the year. So she's been having a lot of success standing and waiting on the lip of Brooks Falls. So I haven't been seeing her using that as much. And as bears gain body mass throughout the summer, they gain fat. They're less athletic as they are earlier in the season. That doesn't mean that they still can't, run down prey.
Right.
They certainly can do that. Even late in the year, bears that are very fat are still very quick animals. But that dash and grab technique, the overall percentage of that being utilized by bears kind of goes down, and they'll start to do more of a slow searching technique, especially for dead and dying salmon that are in Brooks River, just things that can't swim away. So again, going back to that energy economics idea, it's just depending on how easy it is to catch food.
And there's one more technique that's used relatively rarely, perhaps the most rarely, or the one I haven't actually seen any bears doing it yet. Maybe it's more of a fall technique, and that's diving, right, Mike?
Yeah, diving. Diving is definitely a technique that is rarely utilized. It is a technique that only a few bears that we know of will use around here. Number 402 is one of them. One of the bears that we might have the opportunity to see diving. She'll do that in the jacuzzi below Brooks Falls when that spot is vacant. So we'll sometimes see her go in there and completely submerge under the water. And it's kind of hard for a brown bear to do too, right? Because they're carrying a lot of fat reserves on them that makes them very buoyant. So they can learn to dive, though. Not all bears do that. It seems like a lot of bears don't like to have their ears wet. And I am not sure why that is. But, we'll see them just put their faces in the water, but never really get their ears wet for whatever reason. Even if there's a fish that's too deep for them to sort of reach with their forepaws, you'll see them stick their faces in the water and try to reach it with their feet, but they seem very hesitant to get their ears wet. Maybe it's uncomfortable for them. I don't really know for sure, but diving is a rarely utilized technique, but it can be very, very efficient for bears that learn to do that. In fact, there was a bear here for maybe one of the most famous pre-bear cam days bears, if that makes sense. Who was nicknamed Diver, and he was over 30 years old, or estimated to be when he was last seen around the year 2000 or so. And he got very, very large, often by diving for fish in the jacuzzi or at the mouth of Brooks River in different places, getting salmon that weren't accessible to other bears. So again, it's a way that bears can learn and adapt, innovate these different techniques over time. And then one more fishing technique that we will sometimes see at this time of the year, especially when bears are very hungry, is stealing.
Oh, of course, yeah.
So stealing is one of those techniques that's risky, but rewarding depending on who you are, and that's a technique that's not utilized by all bears either.
Yeah, and this is another thing that I got to see the other night was Bear 813 was engaging in some fish stealing from just the base of the falls, right at the jacuzzi, trying to steal from the bear who was fishing on the lip, and doing so sometimes with good success. It seemed like maybe the bear fishing on the lip could have, it just wasn't maybe, so it would usually get away with most of her catch, but 813 was often able to rip off a good-sized chunk for herself and for her cubs as well.
And the cubs actually have to sometimes steal fish from their mother. Mother will tolerate that, but that's something we've been seeing a lot lately, especially from 813's cubs, number 402's cubs. Very hungry, little beasts, and they want, as much food as possible. But mom is extremely hungry because she's not only, looking out for her own energy needs, but those of her cubs, and she's still nursing them at this time of the year. So producing that milk is a huge energy expenditure for them. Mother bears don't necessarily share fish with their cubs. The best that they'll really do is tolerate their cubs taking fish away from them. And you can tell when mother bears are really hungry, they're not really given much opportunity for their cubs to take fish away from them. They'll stand on the fish, cover it up with their paws, try to bite it, but while corralling it from their own offspring.
And then the cubs try to do the same thing vis-a-vis the other siblings.
Right.
A lot of times what you'll see on the lower river, or here at the falls or at the lower river, is that a cub who has succeeded in stealing a fish will immediately try to run into the marsh, and we lose sight of them, and then the other cubs, of course, following after. And so yeah, as soon as a fish is stolen, more fish stealing ensues, and a lot of times we lose sight of that because they run off and try to hide from the other fish thieves who are their siblings.
Here, I know there's several in the queue that you're waiting to be answered. But one final point I think that we want to make about this is, kind of how these things can change, the fishing styles can change over years and seasons. Again, bears are very smart and adaptable. So those young bears that you see trying these dash and grab techniques, or just learning to fish on the lip of the waterfall or in the jacuzzi, they'll become the experts in the future. So that's one of the things that I really enjoy watching over the different years here on Bear Cam, is just the bears learning different fishing styles over time. And this year, bears will change their fishing styles depending on the availability of fish. Like last night, there were hardly any fish at Brooks Falls. I stood at the falls platform from 7 to 10 p.m. local time last night, and I saw only 4 fish being caught during that time. 3 by one bear, 1 by another. So there were very few fish available to bears at the falls last night. So we might see bears moving around more frequently when salmon are less abundant. The warm water temperatures, I'm also wondering if that is affecting the movement of salmon into Brooks River right now. Don't really know for sure, but hot when the water temperature is really, really hot, that impacts the migration of salmon. So the salmon might be holding out in the lake, for example, and waiting for the temperatures just to cool down a little bit before they run up to the waterfall. We don't really know for sure. It could be that the salmon that swam up Naknek River were going to different places over the past couple of days. That's certainly a possibility. So salmon come into waves in Brooks River, but I think, yeah, when you see greater or lesser levels of salmon in the river at the waterfall especially, look for bears to change their strategies to adapt to those specific circumstances. One of the great things about watching Bear Cam. With Explore.org, and I'm joined today by and we're talking about bear fishing styles. We have a few minutes left in our chat, and I know there's several questions in the queue here, so we'll try to get to those with the time remaining. One of the things that I should mention before we go any further, we've thrown out a lot of nicknames and numbers about learn about more, or you want to learn more about the individual bears here at Brooks River. Katmai ebooks into a search engine, and you can find the publications section for Katmai's website, and you can download the Bears of Brooks River, a guide to their identification, lives, and habits. And it's a really great guide to learn more about the Brooks River bears here that we see at Brooks, or fishing at the waterfall right now, including maybe some of the ones that are growling right behind us. So people, John, were wondering, a bunch of things actually. One of the ones that maybe the first one in the queue here that we'll get at is can the bears eat the fish once they have spawned and died? Bears have a really wide ranging diet, but they're not afraid of carrion carcasses, are they?
No, apparently that's the time of the year when they will eat the most fish. So, I mean, if we're looking at it in terms of volume of fresh versus volume of dead fish, maybe you could even make the argument that bears prefer dead fish. I mean, you'd have to ask them to know for sure, but they definitely aren't afraid to go after those dead and dying salmon.
Yeah, they're always looking for the freshest fish, but when you're looking at like individual fish consumed, definitely they're probably eating a lot more dead fish later in the summer than they are like right now, because the fish right now are just so energetic. They have a lot of energy. They're trying to reach their spawning site. So it's those energetic fish are harder to catch unless there's a barrier like Brooks Falls or some sort of topography in the river that makes it difficult for bears to catch them. So they will certainly eat dead and dying salmon. They like the fresher fish because it has more calories in them. But they're not shy about eating carrion. And we'll see that later in the year, especially if you're watching Bear Cam in September and October. Watch the lower river cameras. Watch for bears to just be cruising through the river like patrolling ships, just looking for anything that can't swim away. And they'll be stripping the skin off. They'll be eating like they do kind of right now, stripping the skin off, eating the brains and the roe, as well as the skin primarily, to get the fattier parts of the fish itself. And let's see. And John, when bears are fishing, like in the jacuzzi, are they able to see fish in that spot? Or are they kind of just doing it by feel? And how much are they actually using their claws? Somebody is wondering, to catch fish.
I'm not sure. From what I've seen, and correct me, Mike, it seems like it would be hard to see fish in the jacuzzi just because the water is so turbulent. And so I imagine they're using their other senses more than they're using sight in that particular position.
That's what I suspect as well. I think they are when you're in the jacuzzi, you can't really see fish boiling in the water there very well because it's just full of bubbles. So I think they're using their sense of touch. They're waiting for a fish, to bump into them, and then they're using their claws and their paws to pin that fish to their to the ground or to their bodies. They're not actually trying to skewer the fish. So not in that sense, but they are using those big long claws. I mean, their claws are several inches long on their front feet. So that's a great tool for bears to utilize. Somebody was also wondering, how deep might those plunge pools below Brooks Falls be? Like the jacuzzi is deep. I've had the opportunity to explore Brooks Falls on foot early in the season. Right now, this area is within 100 yards of Brooks Falls is closed to people, to put it simply. So we can't go into the water right now. It wouldn't be safe to do so. It wouldn't be even ethical either because the brown bears need that area to feed. But other times of the year where there aren't brown bears around and I'm allowed to go on the ground, I've been in the water at Brooks Falls. It's kind of fun to explore those places where bears fish. And the jacuzzi actually is very deep. The bears, where they sit in a spot where the water drops off. It's all gravel there, so they're not sitting on bedrock in that exact spot. But they sit in a place where the water drops off very deeply. And I actually one time crawled along the edge of the falls, right to where the water plunged into the jacuzzi, and I kind of slipped in there, and all of a sudden I was over my head. It was at least 5, and I'm taller than 5 foot tall, but it was probably over 5 feet deep. I don't know how deep it was because I was getting kind of turned around, probably just something like a rag in a washing machine. So the current in there was quite strong, and I didn't like it at all. So I tried to get out of there, and I've never tried to really recreate that experience. But it's quite deep in that spot. The around the falls are not nearly as deep as the jacuzzi. That is certainly the deepest spot. Most of the other places are quite shallow. So, and let's see. Somebody's wondering if I've actually seen that young bear standing at the base of the waterfall and swatting at fish. Have you had the chance to see that yet?
I have seen swatting.
Okay.
The swatting I've seen wasn't very successful though.
Yeah, I think it's a young bear trying to make a living at the falls and not really knowing how to do it. I've had an opportunity a couple times to see a bear standing kind of at the edge of the jacuzzi and right at the edge of the waterfall too. There's sort of a little wedge there. And there's a young bear, I think it's number 909 or 910. So a bear that was raised in this area had experienced Brooks Falls as a cub with its mother, and standing there, reaching up, looking at fish jumping, sometimes squatting, occasionally maybe making contact, but also waiting for fish to jump basically right into its face at the base of the waterfall. It's really kind of a new fishing technique that I've never seen before. I don't think I would predict that bear's not really necessarily going to continue to utilize that fishing style as it gets more skilled. We've also seen that bear go into the lip of the waterfall.
So they have been. Yeah. So this bear has been catching fish on the lip recently. So maybe it's finally figured out what a better strategy that works more effectively.
Where do I think is easiest and hardest to fish? That's a good question. They're all good questions. I apologize. They're all good questions. I don't know what. I think it really just depends on the skill of the bear, how big you are, how skilled you are, how experienced you are. I mean, the mature adults make it easy. Naomi, do we need to move over? Okay. All right. You're just nudging. Um, so yeah, I do think it just depends on the experience level of the bear itself. The adults really do make it very very easy. They make it look so easy, but the younger bears demonstrate that fishing is a learned technique you have good at. So that's one of the great things about watching these young bears grow on bear cams. We get to see that process happening with these young bears. We get to see them grow and mature and learn these fishing styles. They have the tools and the instincts to do that, but they got to learn how to do it to get good at it. So I don't think there's necessarily a place that's harder than another. All of those techniques and fishing styles need practice to perfect. But if I was a bear, a bear of my size, I wouldn't be necessarily fishing the lip. I've said this before in a lot of other chats, because those salmon are big, right? 4 to 8 pounds. Imagine someone throwing a 5-pound sack of flour covered in oil at your face and expecting you to catch it in your mouth. I don't think I'd want to do that. So that's one that I would personally avoid, but I'm not a brown bear. So they take what they can get.
So would you be diving for the rotting salmon on the bottom?
Yeah, it would be a lot easier for sure. And I have been known to occasionally, check out dead fish and pick them up and examine them. So,
oh wow.
Yeah, so I
haven't heard that story about you yet.
Yeah, there's actually a live chat that I did a few years ago when I was working as a ranger here. We did one from the falls, exploring the different fishing styles, and I found a dead fish, picked it up, showed people the size. Yeah, so it's interesting to see, compare the size of a salmon to a person, because the brown bears make the fish look small, and they're not necessarily small fish.
And each other too.
Right. And I think maybe we'll try to get to one more question here. Let's see. Who is growling in the background? We've been talking about a lot of individual bears today. A couple of younger bears that we have sitting in the water at the riffles. They're I'm not exactly sure of their identity. I think one looks like number 717, who is a small adult female, borderline adult age, but she's quite small for being like around 5 years old. That's her estimated age, at least. And then the other one is also a young bear, a juvenile bear, perhaps number 910 or 909. I really can't say for sure. But big ears. Young bears, they have really large ears in proportion to their body. So if you want to know, hey, am I looking at an adult bear or a younger bear? If you see a bear with really, really large ears, oftentimes that means it's a bear that's not fully mature. So it could be one of those bears that we call sub-adult bears. But this has been a fun chat, John. I'm glad you were able to join me and lend your insight to these to bear fishing styles. It's one of the things that I enjoy watching the most. It makes bear watching here at Brooks Falls really enjoyable. So thanks for your insight today.
Oh, thanks so much.
And again, my name is Mike Fitz. We'll be back on camera soon to talk more about brown bears and salmon here at Brooks River. So thanks for joining us today.